If you want to pass the GED science exam, you need to know what to study. When you know what you can expect to see on the test, you can study more effectively. This is the first video in a series where I'll be going over what you need to know to get a 145 on the GED science test and pass. In this first video, I'll share an overview of the test and I'll go over the science practices, or the specific skills that you'll need to have to pass the test. The following videos in the series will cover the science content that appears on the test, or the specific things that are helpful for you to know to pass the test. All of the information in this video is adapted from two sources: the official GED.com Science Study Guide and the Kaplan GED Prep Manual, and I will link both of those below for you. Having a better idea of what you'll need to do on the test can help you to better focus your efforts on the best resources for you. This test might be a little intimidating because we know that science is a huge discipline. Luckily for you, there's only a limited number of scientific topics that are going to appear on this test. Also, like the previous test we've talked about, this test is less about your ability to memorize and reproduce specific facts and figures, and more about your ability to understand, interpret, and analyze scientific ideas. Like the other subject test, to pass the GED science exam, you'll need a score of 145 or above. The test is 90 minutes long and it consists of 34 questions related to passages, graphs, tables, and other graphics. According to the Kaplan GED Prep Manual, 40% of the test is about the life sciences. So biology, genetics, the environment. 40% of the questions are about physical science, including chemistry and physics topics. And the remaining 20% of questions are about earth and space science. In order to do well on all of these questions, there are three big categories of skills that you will need to have. Those are reading for meaning in science, designing and interpreting experiments, and using numbers and graphics in science. When I work with GED students, we usually tackle the RLA and the math exams first, because a lot of the skills that we're going to talk about today are going to seem very familiar to you if you've watched my RLA and math videos. You'll be able to recycle a lot of the same competencies in order to do well on the science test. Alright, first let's talk about reading for meaning in science. We've talked about reading for meaning in RLA and in social studies, and this is very similar. On the science test, you'll need to be able to read a scientific passage and identify evidence in the passage that supports a theory or conclusion. You'll also need to be able to make sense of information in two sources that might offer a differing claim. An example that appears in the GED Study Guide for Science is reading two different articles that have to do with humanity's role in climate change. You'll need to determine whether the information in each passage either supports or contradicts the other. Something that will support your ability to do this will be to become familiar with the specific scientific vocabulary and symbols that will appear in these kinds of passages. Again, you don't need to memorize anything or become a scientific expert, but it will be helpful for you to be familiar with visuals like tables and graphs, as well as specific symbols that are frequently used, like common units of measurement, degree signs, symbols for atomic elements, and common scientific formulas. We'll go more into depth about the specific vocabulary that you'll need in the coming videos about the three scientific domains. Next, let's talk about designing and interpreting scientific experiments. Here's where we're going to do the real heavy lifting in this video. In order to do this, you're going to need to have a good handle on the scientific method. The scientific method is a way of thinking that all scientists use in order to observe the world and draw valid conclusions. Here are the 5 basic steps of the scientific method. First, observe something and ask a question about it. Here's the example from the GED Science Study Guide. I purchased 2 identical raspberry plants and I give one to my neighbor. We both plant them in our backyards. I notice after a few weeks that my neighbor's raspberry plant is growing a lot more raspberries than mine is. And I wonder, why is that? Next, collect data or facts that can be observed about the phenomenon that you're wondering about. In our example, I might want to start thinking about how many hours of sunlight our plants are getting, how much water we're giving them, and what's the quality of the soil that they're planted in. Number 3, after our initial data collection, form a hypothesis. A hypothesis is an educated guess that answers the question that you're wondering about. For example, I might notice that all of our plants are getting the same amount of sunlight and water, but that the pH or the acidity of the soil that they're planted in is very different. A reasonable hypothesis based on the data that I've collected and the question that I'm asking might be that raspberry plants prefer to grow in more acidic soil. Step 4, test the hypothesis. We do this by designing an experiment where we're going to change one factor while controlling or keeping the rest the same. In an experiment, the phenomenon that we're observing is called the dependent variable, and the element that we're manipulating or changing is called the independent variable. In our example, I'm not going to change anything about how I treat my raspberry plant, except that I'm going to add some ground sulfur to my garden to change the acidity of the soil. Then I'll observe what happens. So in my experiment, the acidity of the soil is the independent variable because that's what I'm changing, and the dependent variable is the number of berries that my plant will produce, because I'm predicting that the amount of berries that I get depends on the acidity of the soil. Finally, draw a conclusion about your hypothesis based on the results of your experiment. You might conclude that your hypothesis is supported by your data, or you might not. If it looks like your hypothesis is true, in my example, if my plant starts to grow more berries, you might want to try to repeat it to ensure that you can continue to get the same results. If it doesn't seem like your hypothesis is correct, no big deal. You might change your hypothesis and start your experiment again. Scientists use this process over and over again before they are certain that what they're concluding from their experiment is the truth. When it seems like their hypothesis is true based on many iterations of an experiment, scientists consider that a scientific theory. In science, theories are ideas that we're pretty sure are correct based on a lot of evidence. However, what's cool about science is there's always room for a theory to be changed based on new data. On the GED test, you'll read descriptions of different phenomenon, and you'll identify reasonable hypotheses and conclusions. What's the independent and dependent variable in an experiment? You'll also look at data in tables and graphs and determine whether a conclusion can be supported by that data. When scientists are looking at data and making conclusions, one of the things that they have to consider is what is the population and what is the sample. In a scientific experiment, the population would be the entire group that we're asking a question about. In my experiment, that might be raspberry plants in general. Since I definitely did not have the capacity to observe every raspberry plant that exists, my experiment just considered a sample of raspberry plants, or specifically my raspberry plant. However, my experiment probably would not be considered representative of all raspberry plants because my sample was very small. For example, it might have been better if I had 10 or 20 or even 50 raspberry plants to do the experiment on. My experiment also would have been better if I could have implemented a control group, or some plants that I would leave alone to compare to the plants that I'm treating. Lastly, to make their samples even better, scientists tried to randomize the sample that they select. In my example, if I did have 50 plants to study, I wouldn't just split them down the middle and treat half on the left and leave half on the right. Instead, I would randomly select which plants to treat, and that would help me to eliminate any chance that something's going on the left that's not going on the right. One last point related to sampling and populations. Sometimes it's not ethical to conduct an experiment on a random sample of a population. An example that appears in the Kaplan GED prep manual has to do with whether some chemicals that are used for farming are harmful to local wildlife populations. If the hypothesis is that the chemicals are harmful, it wouldn't be ethical to increase the use of the chemicals simply to conduct an experiment. However, scientists could conduct what's considered an observational study, where they identify a random sample of locations where these chemicals are already more heavily used and a random sample of locations where they're used less. Then they could observe their dependent variable and try to determine whether the chemicals are having some effect. However, it can be more difficult in an observational experiment to determine that it is your independent variable that is actually causing the change. In summary, you want to have an idea about good experimental design and be able to analyze different experiments to determine whether the experiment itself is valid or whether the conclusions that are drawn are reasonable. Quick pause here. Michelle from the future. I'm editing and I am aware that this video is gonna get very dark. A storm rolled in, but we're just gonna roll with it. If this video is helpful for you, I would ask you to please click the like button just so that YouTube knows that this is a good resource for GED studiers. Thank you as always for watching, and let's get back. The third science practice that you should be prepared with is using numbers and graphics in science. Again, if you've already taken and passed the math exam, you're probably in a good spot to extend those skills over to the science exam. You do get to use the TI-30 Access Multiview Calculator just like on the math test on this test, and I'll link that below. One thing that you'll be asked to do is apply science formulas that are provided on the test. For example, you might be asked to convert a temperature from degrees Celsius to degrees Fahrenheit using this formula. This is super easy with your calculator, especially since the calculator does know order of operations, so you can simply substitute the degrees Celsius into the formula for C, and it will give you the value for Fahrenheit. And again, that formula will be provided to you on the test. You'll also be asked to describe data sets using statistical measures. For example, you might be asked to find the mean, the median, the mode, the range, or the high or low of a data set. You'll need to have a basic understanding of probability in order to determine the likelihood that an event will happen, and you should be able to use combinations and permutations to determine how many different ways objects can be arranged. Finally, you'll need to be able to read and interpret different types of tables and graphs, including line graphs, bar graphs, histograms, dot plots, scatter plots, and more. Again, I reviewed all of these skills in more detail for the math exam, so definitely go back there and make sure that you feel confident with all of these skills. Okay, so those are the 3 big science practice skills that you will need to have to do well on the GED science exam. The best way to improve your science practice skills is to practice by trying to answer questions like the ones that you'll see on the test. You can look at the examples provided in the science section of the GED.com site, and I'll also put a link to the Kaplan GED prep manual below. It has a lot of specific advice about reading the passages and looking at the graphs, as well as answering the questions that will appear on that test. You can also use any GED prep manual that your library has available to borrow. On this channel, I make videos about how to study more effectively so that you can achieve your goals. In the coming weeks, I'll be discussing the content that appears on the GED science exam, including life sciences, physical sciences, and earth and space sciences. So please subscribe if you'd like to learn more. You can also check out my video about how to get started studying for the GED exams and my 3 playlists about how to study for the GED RLA, the GED Math, and the GED Social Studies exams. If this video was helpful for you, please press the like button so that YouTube knows that this is a great resource for studiers. Thank you as always for watching, and until next time, happy studying.